Our next movie is a film version of a popular video game. It's called Super Mario Brothers, and it doesn't work at all.
So a few weeks ago, this tweet about the new Last of Us show on HBO blew up because it reignited the debate about adaptations of video games into other media. And I was glad to see that people, for the most part, seem to understand that yes, there are good adaptations of games to TV and movies, and we don't need to make this such a big a deal anymore. But the whole discussion got me wondering about why this idea of video game adaptations always being bad is still hanging around after all this time. So I'm here today to look at the history of video game adaptations, as well as what makes The Last of Us show unique compared to other game adaptations. When it comes to video games being made into movies, there are basically two movies that are responsible for the idea of video game movies being bad. Well, technically 7 movies, but we'll get to those. The first movie is, of course, the Super Mario Bros. Movie. Everybody knows about this train wreck. It's been a punchline on the internet for decades. Now, as someone who enjoys bad movies, the Mario movie is actually a pretty great bad movie, but that's obviously not the brand profile Nintendo wanted for the series in 1993, and Nintendo's response to this movie probably affected video game movies more than the movie itself. The movie was a very public mess that had pretty much nothing to do with its source material, and after its release, Nintendo basically said, alright, we are never doing that again. Nintendo really only eased up on this stance in the last few years. All the early internet memes about this movie, and what a mess it was, did a lot to cement the idea that video game movies are bad. The other movies that we of course have to take into consideration are the Resident Evil movies. If you want to blame the reputation of video game movies on any one person, it's this guy, Paul W.S. Anderson. If there was a Hall of Fame for failing upwards, Paul W.S. Anderson would have his own wing dedicated to him. The man has been pumping out absolute garbage for 30 years, and yet somehow his movies have made billions, and he is married to Mila Jovovich. Now, in the last few years, I've watched through every Resident Evil movie, and I think the best thing I can say about these movies is that there's usually something interesting in each of them. The second one I remember being genuinely pretty fun. But for the most part, these movies are aggressively mediocre. The fact that this series spans 6 movies and nearly 2 decades really set the bar for video game movies to be schlocky and nonsensical. And I'm not asking Paul W.S. Anderson to make Saving Private Ryan, but especially towards the end of the series, it really feels like nobody involved in them cares at all. This is not the series that you want to be your ambassador for video game adaptations, but for many years that's exactly what the Resident Evil series was. Now you may have noticed that we've just been talking about movies so far. And for a long time, that's what most video game adaptations were. Some games made for kids, like Pokemon, obviously have long-running cartoon series, but pretty much every adaptation of games geared towards older audiences ended up as a wildly generic action movie. And I think a big part of why video game adaptations mostly didn't work during this era is that movies really aren't a good medium to adapt a game into. Video games have changed a lot over the years, but these days you can expect almost any game with a campaign to be at least 15 or 20 hours long. And that's a pretty conservative estimate in most cases. When you talk about JRPGs or even MMOs, that number goes up quite a bit. Add in side quests and DLC, and you're faced with a pretty impossible task if you're trying to condense a whole video game down to a 2-hour-long movie. When I was watching this past year's Game Awards, I had an interesting conversation with a friend about whether or not Elden Ring was a good game to nominate for Best Narrative. And I think Elden Ring is a great example of how video game narratives are different from narratives in other forms of media. For one thing, good luck fitting Elden Ring into a 2-hour movie. The average Elden Ring playthrough probably spends 2 hours just looking at respawn screens. But the strength of Elden Ring's storytelling is that you can be invested in it as much or as little as you want. The game has an incredibly rich lore behind it that's accessible to players who are interested, but the game's not so insecure about its story that has to hold you down and show you how hard they worked on it. Video games are unique in that they can create a fully realized world that every player interacts with in their own way. Even as you mow down all the gods in Elden Ring, the player is just one small part of a huge story. And so I don't think Elden Ring fits an award like Best Narrative because its style of storytelling ends up almost transcending what we think of as a narrative. Now I want to circle back to The Last of Us. When I first saw this tweet, I figured it probably came from a quote that got taken out of context, or maybe it was even something that this fan page just made up on their own. But I was surprised to find that this idea actually came from an article in New Yorker magazine that interviewed Last of Us creator Neil Druckmann. The article also features Craig Mazin, who served as the other main showrunner for The Last of Us and previously created HBO's mega-hit series Chernobyl. And the sense that I get from this article is that Druckmann and Mazin really do view Last of Us as the first great adaptation of a video game property to film or television. So let's dive into that a little deeper. Now in this article, Neil Druckmann makes a lot of points about video game adaptations that I actually agree with, and some of these points are even points I've made earlier in this video, but he very much treats the video game curse for adaptations like it's still a real thing, and I think he gets tripped up on an idea that's very pervasive in all forms of media right now. It's the idea that a piece of media has to be dark for it to be truly great.
It's a me, Mario.
Druckmann mentions at one point that there still hasn't really been a good movie adaptation of a video game property, apart from movies made for kids like Detective Pikachu and the Sonic movies. But why does the fact that these movies are for kids disqualify them from being great adaptations? I would argue that those movies do check all the boxes of a good adaptation because they take the source material of their games and convert them into a story that works well for a movie. You could even argue that the insanely long run of the Pokemon anime represents a successful video game adaptation as well. And if we want to say that video game adaptations aren't fully legitimate until we have a good adult-oriented game adaptation, well, we have plenty of those now too. Everybody already loves Castlevania and Arcane, and I would say the recent Cyberpunk Edgerunner show is probably my favorite adaptation I've seen yet. So we have solid, fun video game movies for kids, and we have multiple great streaming series that are geared toward older audiences and even expand on their series source material. So what is this video game adaptation curse that Druckmann and Mazin seem to still think is lurking? What I see in this article is that Neil Druckmann seems to believe he was the first guy to really do serious big boy stories in video games. But it's not hard to see that this just isn't true. There's an interesting anecdote in this article where Neil Druckmann talks about seeing the movie Children of Men when he was still pretty new to Naughty Dog, and feeling angry that there weren't any games telling stories as compelling as the story of that movie. Now here's the thing. Children of Men came out in 2006. Here are a couple of video games that came out just in that year. Okami, Half-Life 2 Episode 1, Elder Scrolls 4, Shadow of the Colossus, a game that is still considered one of the best stories in a video game. And Druckmann even talks about how Shadow of the Colossus developer Team Ico's previous game, which was called Ico, which came out in 2001, was influential for him in how he viewed storytelling in video games. And this is to say nothing of the stuff like Silent Hill 2 and Grim Fandango, which had both been around for years at this point. I mean, Grim Fandango came out in 1998 and was cultured enough to pull inspiration from movies like Casablanca. I think it's also worth noting that most of the games I've listed here have never been adapted to other mediums, and I would argue that a big reason for that is that these games are very smart about maximizing the ways in which gaming as a medium is unique. These games really wouldn't suit any other medium. I mean, good luck getting the audience to draw a circle to continue during the Okami movie. Where The Last of Us show is unique among video game adaptations is that the original game tells a story which is basically already an extended movie. And so Neil Druckmann seems to have this idea that the way for video games to break through as a medium is to have a game with a story built like a movie converted into an actual movie. Druckmann says at one point that a truly great video game adaptation could enlighten this whole other audience that cares about storytelling and hasn't realized there's amazing storytelling happening in games. And I really don't get this way of thinking because it implies that legitimacy for video games as a storytelling medium has to come from outside of video games. To him, the adaptation curse isn't that video games aren't made into good movies, it's that video game stories haven't been deemed worthy of mainstream audiences. Now, even if a non-gaming audience watches and enjoys The Last of Us, do you really think your grandma or your Uncle Bobby is going to watch it and say, well, I guess video games really do tell compelling stories, and go buy a PlayStation? I don't think audiences interact with a show in this way. If you enjoyed The Sopranos, maybe you go check out Goodfellas after you're done with the show, but I don't think you suddenly go about your day saying, wow, I guess great stories about New Jersey mobsters can be made. When Neil Druckmann says that there hasn't been a great video game adaptation yet, I think what he's really saying is there hasn't been a Neil Druckmann adaptation yet. I think the irony of Neil Druckmann's position on video game adaptations is that it seems to reveal that he himself looks down on video games as a storytelling medium. Games like Uncharted and The Last of Us are often compared to movies because they very deliberately emulate that style of storytelling. And while I don't think there's anything wrong with making a story-focused or cinematic video game, you do want the game to still be a game at the end of the day. The decision to lean so heavily on cinematic storytelling and jump at the opportunity to convert Last of Us into a big-budget HBO series gives you the sense that Druckmann just kind of wants to make TV shows, but finds himself stuck having to work on video games. And I think The Last of Us is certainly one of the better stories that's been told of a video game, but I definitely wouldn't say it's the best, and games like Portal 2 or Bioshock tell very compelling, big-budget stories while also being much more in tune with what makes a video game. One thing I want to make clear in closing is that despite everything I've talked about here, I do think The Last of Us show is actually pretty solid. I started working on this video shortly after the first episode came out. As I'm recording this, episode 3 just aired, which is definitely my favorite episode of the show so far. As I'm writing this, we've already seen people talking about the show in a much different way because of episode 3. And so any and all beef I have with The Last of Us really isn't about the show itself, but rather the meta-narrative that exists around the show. I mean, going to the New Yorker to anoint the show as the first great game adaptation a month before it's even out is certainly something. And I want to tackle this side of things with The Last of Us because this whole narrative about video game adaptations is outdated and does a disservice to how good video game storytelling can be and has been. Video game adaptations still struggle sometimes, especially when it comes to movies, but that risk is present with any piece of art that gets translated from one medium to another. And while it's been cool to see video game adaptations really blossoming in the last few years, video games don't need to prove themselves in another medium to be a legitimate art form on their own. Hey there, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, we would really appreciate if you subscribe to the channel. We put a lot of work into these videos, and to be honest with you, I would be really excited to hit 1,000 subs. And leave a comment too. Agree or disagree, we want to hear what people think about the state of storytelling in gaming.